The development context of BrokenLore UNFOLLOW gives off the distinct feeling of a small project with huge ambition. It wants to be a first-person horror game, but with a clear thesis on social media, bullying, and mental health. This shines through in everything shown so far, including the game's structure and visual identity. The first thing that catches the eye is how Serafini Productions ties the theme to the narrative starting point. You play as Anne, a bullying victim trapped in a surreal nightmare, and the promise is that the terror won't just come from scares, but from facing choices and pains of the past, which for me is where psychological horror is usually strongest when it works. From what the developer has been communicating, you can notice a very direct intention to converse with current problems, especially the influence of social media, and this places the game on delicate ground. If it's too subtle, it becomes just aesthetic. If it's too didactic, it becomes a sermon. What I liked about the demo's vibe is this choice for a terror based more on persecution and continuous tension, with creatures and situations that seem to represent specific traumas rather than random monsters just for shock value. And there is a product detail that says a lot about the project's stage. The game is already well-positioned commercially with a set date, January 16th, 2026, for PC, Steam, PS5, and Xbox Series S, with a publisher and even a deluxe edition with extras and early access on PS5. So it no longer feels like that indie title that might vanish out of nowhere in the final stretch. Another thing I find curious in this context is the casting strategy. The game cites well-known names like the Sphere Hunter and Akidirist in the cast, and this gives the impression that the marketing is trying to pierce the bubble of Steam indie horror by using people with a strong presence in internet culture, which matches the theme of Unfollow itself. For me, the biggest test of this development will be transforming the central idea into a variety of situations. They promise multiple endings influenced by choices and a heavy focus on the protagonist's smartphone with various functions. So the hope is that this turns into mechanics that change how you play and not just a pretty menu inside the game. The story seems to aim less for the immediate scare and more for that terror that keeps itching afterward, the sensation of being trapped in a distorted version of yourself, fed by the judgment of others and your own look in the mirror. From what has already been disclosed, everything revolves around Anne, a bullying victim who falls into a surreal nightmare and needs to face echoes of the past. And this, for a game that talks about social media and mental health, is a very direct and potentially strong premise. The choice to place Anne as someone marked by bullying already defines a type of horror that is more intimate, because it isn't a random haunted house. It is her mind becoming the scenery, the rule, and the punishment. And the proposal to translate traumas into creatures and persecution situations, instead of just using monsters as decoration, is the kind of idea that, when it works, makes you feel that every encounter has meaning, not just gameplay. The demo and the way the game is being described gives an impression of psychological horror, of friction, exploration, puzzles, and survival moments that seem to exist to keep you within the discomfort long enough without letting the mind breathe. I also liked the concept of surreal spaces breaking familiarity, as if memories and symbols were repackaged to provoke you. This is usually more effective than just piling up jump scares. The dark side of social media theme is a terrain that many works tread in an obvious way, but here, the nightmare frame seems to marry well with the subject. Judgment, comparison, exposure, and paranoia are emotions that are almost game mechanics by nature. When the narrative points to things like mental health and even body image distortion, the feeling is that Unfollow wants to be uncomfortable in a specific way, not edgy, but personal. The idea of depending on Anne's smartphone as a central tool for the narrative is one of the smartest decisions because it doesn't sound like a gimmick. It is literally the object most loaded with anxiety in this theme. If it serves to illuminate, investigate, and survive, it becomes an extension of addiction and the need for validation. You use what hurts you to stay alive, and that is a very cruel metaphor. When the marketing itself speaks about each area functioning as a puzzle and metaphor, it gives me hope for a narrative tightly bound to the level design, the kind of game where you understand the character through the space, not just through cutscenes. And since the BrokenLore series sells itself as an anthology with optional clues and meta-narrative connecting the games, UNFOLLOW can deliver a closed arc and still plant mystery for those who like to hunt for details and theorize. The gameplay conveys a very specific sensation. It is that first-person horror that doesn't just want to scare you, it wants to make you uncomfortable with small things: interface, sound, light, and the way the world reacts to Anne's mental state. This hits on what Serafini Productions itself has been reinforcing, a psychological horror about the dark side of social media, with puzzles and chases tied to the theme and symbolism. In the demo, what caught me the most was the pacing. It alternates slow exploration with moments of more direct tension, and this cadence helps it avoid becoming a walking sim or a corridor of scares. The demo is a mix of exploration, puzzle solving, and peaks of survival, always with the feeling that you are digging into something personal and uncomfortable, not just looking for a key to a door. The atmosphere design is the glue that holds everything together. Cutout lighting, shadows that hide more than they show, and audio that seems to grab you by the collar when you try to relax. This focus on light, shadow, and sound appears frequently, and in practice, it works, because the game leaves room for the imagination to complete the horror, which for me is always stronger than showing the monster all the time. Another idea I liked, and which gives gameplay identity, not just story identity, is the use of Anne's smartphone as a central tool, illuminating, revealing clues, and giving you resources to survive encounters. The official communication highlights that you will depend on the smartphone to explore the darkness and find clues. And in the demo, this gives a very diegetic air. You feel like you are using an object of the world, not a generic HUD. When the game shifts to predator and prey, it seems more interested in pressuring you psychologically than in testing pure reflexes, and this matches the proposal of manifesting traumas in the form of creatures. These monsters are like symbols of trauma and also of the structure with multiple endings influenced by choices. So one can expect that these sequences won't just be obstacles, but part of the discourse, even if this depends on how the final content will vary outside the demo. Technically, the impression that remains is high ambition for an indie horror, and the demo already delivers this mood quite well, but one can also notice that there are still rough edges and mechanics to be optimized. UNFOLLOW is the type of game where the graphics aren't just pretty or ugly. They are a direct part of how the terror hits you, and this becomes very clear playing the demo and seeing the most recent trailers. Visually, it embraces a surreal, distorted, and purposefully uncomfortable style that marries very well with the themes of bullying, trauma, and social media pressure. The first thing that draws attention is how the game mixes moderate realism with very abstract, almost dreamlike elements in Anne's memories. The scenarios feel like commonplaces contaminated by something rotten, as if someone had taken childhood memories and passed a nightmare filter over them. The use of color is emotionally aggressive. Lots of strong contrasts, heavy shadows, and points of light that almost blind in dark corridors, reinforcing the sensation of anxiety. It isn't that ultra-dark horror just for the sake of being dark. You can see enough, but always with that feeling that the environment is wrong, as if it were saturated by the character's own mental wear. The monsters and distorted figures are clearly thought out to represent Anne's specific traumas, and this shines through in the design, which is less generic horror monster and more visual metaphor walking in your direction. They aren't the most hyper-realistic models in the world, but their strength lies in the concept: maladjusted proportions, exaggerated body parts, silhouettes that resemble judgment, body exposure, and invasive stares linked to themes like body dysmorphia and bullying. The environments the demo shows have a great sense of composition. Childhood bedrooms, school hallways, and everyday spaces are reimagined as mental labyrinths, with displaced objects, marked walls, and visual details that tell the story without needing dialogue. It isn't a game that impresses by the size of the scenarios, but rather by how much every corner seems loaded with meaning, as if everything there were a piece of the protagonist's head. Technically, the graphics seem more focused on art direction than on pushing hardware limits. Models and textures are good enough, but they aren't at the level of a photorealistic AAA, and honestly, they don't need to be. What holds it up well is the ensemble: lighting, particles, small visual glitches, and screen distortions work as an extension of the social media and mental collapse narrative. So even when something is dirty, it seems intentional. A detail that helps sell the graphics a lot is how the interface and elements linked to Anne's smartphone blend with the game world, creating a digital nightmare visual, almost as if the scenery were contaminated by online cruelty. This gives the game its own identity. It's not just another horror. It is a horror visually marked by the era of networks, with textures, noise, and symbols that resemble feeds, notifications, and cyberbullying. For those who like psychological horror where the visuals are a direct extension of the character's mind, the demo's graphics not only work, but leave you wanting to see how far the final version will push the sickly and symbolic aesthetic. In the demo, the performance conveys the feeling of almost there. You can play and enjoy the atmosphere, but there is still that risk of drops and occasional stutters that remind you it is an indie project in Unreal. At the same time, what has been disclosed so far suggests that the team is aiming for a relatively stable experience at launch, with a focus on modern upscaling features to help on PC. The game usually holds an okay flow when you're just exploring and walking slowly, because the horror pacing helps hide any small oscillation. But when rapid camera changes, heavier corridors, or transitions enter, you can feel that the frame time can become irregular, that micro stutter that doesn't crash the game, but gives a poke at the immersion. The most important part for me isn't even the average FPS, but the consistency. In my performance tests with an RX 6700 XT, the average stays above 60 FPS, but the 1% lows drop below 60, which is exactly the kind of thing you feel as a hiccup in gameplay. You can also feel that classic Unreal seasoning in some moments, not necessarily a constant stutter, but a punctual irregularity that seems linked to loading an area. The positive side is that DLSS and frame generation support give the impression that the team is trying to give you tools to adjust performance without totally killing the aesthetic. For a game that lives on lighting and atmosphere, this is almost mandatory, having a way to relieve GPU weight without turning everything into a blurry soup. If the question is it worth buying at launch or waiting, the most honest answer is BrokenLore UNFOLLOW seems like one of those games that are worth it day one if you are buying for the short and intense psychological horror experience and want to support this type of project. But if you are sensitive to games with rough edges and bugs, waiting for the first few weeks might be safer. From what the demo already shows, the game bets heavily on mood, discomfort, and symbolism. It is not a combat survival horror. It is a first-person horror focused on exploration, tension, and narrative about bullying and social pressure, including social media as a central theme. So the launch purchase makes more sense when you want this type of horror that leaves you thinking afterward, not necessarily one that gives you a build and an arsenal. The reason I consider waiting for a part of the audience is that there is a clear history of the demo evolving and still going through an optimization and mechanic refinement phase, as the devs themselves commented in community discussions. This doesn't mean the launch will arrive broken, but it is a sign that the game might arrive better after 1 or 2 patches when the dust settles and configurations are more rounded. Now, there is a strong argument for day 1. What was officially disclosed points to multiple endings and choices influencing the outcome, in addition to a smartphone with central functions in exploration and survival. And this usually is the kind of thing that yields a very memorable first playthrough when you enter without spoilers. It is that horror that works best when you don't know what kind of rule the nightmare will invent in the next room. The game is perfect for those who enjoy surreal psychological horror, with visual metaphors and heavy themes linked to mental health and bullying. It is also a full plate for those who like games that tell a story through the environment, clues, and sensation more than through constant action. I would not indicate this game if you are looking for a more gameplay-driven horror, with frequent combat, or if you have little patience for walking sims and puzzle resolution, or if you like very direct objectives with little abstraction. And also for those who get uncomfortable with the themes: bullying, social pressure, online identity, because the game seems to make a point of poking at this topic. Buying at launch makes sense if you already liked the tone of the demo and want to live the story with minimal spoilers.
Come on, my parents are out for dinner. We'll have the whole house to ourselves. Let's have a movie night. Popcorn and ice cream.
But that's exactly the point. I don't want to eat those things anymore. I don't want to be fat anymore.
But you're not. You're just...
Just what? Chubby? Plump? Rotund? Say it any way you like. I suck. I really am a whale.
I will be waiting for you. Don't worry, Anne. You will always be a good friend to me.